Frontal car crashes. Each year they kill thousands of Americans and injure hundreds of thousands. The majority of all fatal injuries to people in collisions occur in head-on and angled frontal car crashes. In a frontal crash, it's all over in a split in the front seat of a car like this. But these test dummies are me, or you, or someone you love. Watch. The car is a wreck, and the occupants are a wreck too. But it needn't be this way for them or for us. This is a vehicle test track, and these are test dummies. On the highway, they'd be real people. Let's take a very slowed-down look at what happened to dummies like these in that frontal crash we saw a moment ago. The car is traveling at 35 miles an hour. Now the car contacts an object ahead. Here it's a test barrier. In the real world, it might be a bridge pier, a tree, a pole, or another vehicle. The car is being brought to a crushing stop. Meanwhile, inside the car, the people keep moving forward at about the same speed, 35 miles per hour, until they crash into the structures ahead.
Their crash began
a split second after the car struck the barrier. Here's the crash again from inside the car. Now the car has started to impact the barrier. A fraction of a second later, the unrestrained occupants begin their crash. In that critical moment, had the people been provided with sufficient restraining protection, their chances of being killed or seriously hurt would have been greatly reduced. In slow motion, that's what goes on in a frontal crash, an event that in reality takes place so fast it's over like that. Researchers have known for decades that much of the death and serious injury in frontal crashes is needless. If the bodies of the people in the crashes are properly restrained, that is, slowed down more gently and kept from smashing into the car's interior structure, they're much less likely to be killed or seriously injured. Seat belts can do the job, but only if they're worn.
Today, most cars on the highways have belts.
But for decades, cars had no belts at all, with grim results. Early research and testing showed that lap belts could reduce fatal and other injuries in some types of crashes. In crash tests like these, lap belts kept dummies from being thrown out of crashing cars, and the belts limited the dummies' forward motion in frontal impacts, such as this 18-mile-an-hour test. But despite the evidence, and despite the growing demands of physicians and others, most auto companies did not provide even optional belts until the mid-1950s. Meanwhile, the totals of those needlessly killed and injured in crashes continued to mount. Finally, Ford Motor Company began to market factory-installed optional lap belts on its 1956 models. Demand was greater than the company expected, and in less than 2 years, Ford sold 160,000 cars with optional belts and furnished an additional 200,000 belts to its dealers for installation in new cars. In the early 1960s, a few states enacted laws requiring that new cars be delivered with front seat lap belts as standard equipment. Many auto manufacturers objected to such laws, but as more and more states passed them, lap belts became standard across the nation. Finally, the federal government required that lap and shoulder belts be standard in all new cars starting in 1968. A Swedish company, Volvo, had long favored standard equipment lap and shoulder belts, and starting in 1959, voluntarily provided them in Sweden. A few years later, it did so in the United States. Svante Mannervik, a Volvo executive, explains why.
In the mid-50s, we made some, which we today would call very primitive studies, to see what could be done to get the passengers safe and sound through a crash. And it very soon became very evident to us that you had to fix the passenger by a seatbelt to the chair where he was sitting. We had to demonstrate this in different ways. Of course, this could easily be done just by showing what happened to an egg, which was put in a basket or in a small car without a belt or protected by a belt. and it was quite obvious that the belt would give a very good protection. There were no discussion about it. Belts should be introduced into our cars. Studies were made in 1974 of the total car population in Sweden, and you would find at that time that about 40% of the occupants in cars in general were using seatbelts. That usage was doubled when the mandatory law came.
In U.S. traffic, no more than about 30% of adult drivers and passengers use belts. The rest, some 70% of occupants, aren't wearing belts when they travel and if they crash. For children, the lack of crash protection is even greater. More than 90% are traveling about with nothing at all to restrain them in crashes.
I don't normally put a seatbelt on. I do short driving to the grocery store or to a shopping center. And I find it inconvenient. I was in an accident and I didn't have my seatbelt on, but I know I was a mistake, but I don't do it.
I don't see where you need them, really, to drive carefully. And I've never had any problems. I just don't like seatbelts.
I don't wear them ever. I've always kept them buckled behind me in the seat because I don't like to feel so tied down.
I realize I can lose my life by not, but when I am in a hurry, I feel that, I'm fine without it.
I find them, frankly, too much of a nuisance to put on and take off when we're just going short distances between stores.
Well, really, almost nobody I know wears seatbelts. That's the truth.
I'm not wearing my seatbelt this morning because in this automobile, the seat belt is very difficult to find. It's buried somewhere underneath the seat.
Every time I put them on, you go a block or go 2 blocks, you got to take them right back off, so I just don't use them at all.
Mostly they're a pain in the neck.
I don't think when I get in the car to put them on right away.
Dr. William Haddon Jr. is president of the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety.
We could pass a law that told everybody they have to wear belts, knowing full well that not everybody would. A number of countries have passed laws that require people to use belts. They have sharply increased belt use, and that's a very positive gain. On the other hand, they have not increased belt use to anywhere near 100%. Or we could try to persuade people voluntarily to use belts, also knowing that many people would not do so. We could also rig up some sort of interlock system so that the ignition wouldn't work unless the belts were fastened.
This car has an ignition interlock system. If you don't buckle up, you can't start the car. Ford Motor Company developed the ignition interlock and promoted it intensively. In 1970, Ford petitioned the federal government to require the interlock on all new cars. The government refused, but Ford kept insisting. Finally, the government yielded to Ford and required the interlock on all new cars starting in 1973. Soon, people were complaining to Congress about the ignition interlock. One senator said that people all around the country had written and telephoned their displeasure with the annoying and irritating buzzers and interlocks. Another senator said he knew of nothing more universally resented than the interlock requirement. In October 1974, Congress outlawed the interlock standard.
One of the many nice things about airbags is that they don't hassle anyone or require anyone to do anything, except, of course, the manufacturer who should put them in. The idea of things that work automatically to protect you when you need protection is not a new one with airbags. Electrical fuses in our houses and in our automobiles are examples. And the sprinkler systems that protect against fire when it breaks out that are present in movie theaters and restaurants and many other public places also illustrate this basic principle of things which work automatically when there is danger that might otherwise result in injury to people. The problem in crashes is to spread the forces both in depth and also as gently as possible over the surface of the body. If you land on a sharp piece of the vehicle interior, for example, it's just like ending on the edge of a knife or stepping on a nail sticking up from the floor. What you really want to do is to get rid of that localizing, concentrating of forces in such a way that they do no damage to your body. Belts do this to some extent, but belts are relatively narrow and they only apply to the pelvis and across the chest. whereas an airbag takes a much broader area of the body and spreads the forces far more gently, both across it and as you ride into it as if you were going into a very large pillow.
Like belts, airbags have been a practical reality for years. The concept of an air-filled buffer to protect people in car crashes was outlined as early as 1941, and patents began to be issued in the 1950s. Extensive research during the 1960s and early 1970s, including crash testing with human volunteers as well as dummies, brought airbag technology to a very advanced state, entirely ready for large-scale practical application. And it was becoming clear that belts and airbags were compatible in providing protection to car occupants. That the best protection was a combination of automatic airbags to gently spread the impact forces in frontal and front angle crashes, and lap belts, which when worn reduce the chance of injury in many types of crashes. In 1974, the federal government estimated that if every car on the road had airbags for the driver and front seat passengers, nearly 9,000 deaths and 500,000 injuries would be eliminated each year. In 1969, a leading developer of airbag systems, the Eaton Corporation, released a film describing airbag technology. Here are excerpts.
With more than 60 years' experience supplying the automotive industry, Eaton, Yale, and Town, a diversified multinational company headquartered in Erie View Tower, Cleveland, Ohio, has now come up with a revolutionary new crash restraint system, Autoceptor. 20 miles an hour, simulating the action with parents and an unrestrained child. 30 miles an hour at 30 degrees. Slow motion reveals the occupants were thoroughly protected. Throughout most of Autoceptor's development, Eaton, Yale, and Town worked closely with Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, and American Motors, as well as many foreign car manufacturers. Over 2 million miles of testing subjected Autoceptor to a repeated series of jolts and vibrations. Autoceptor will deploy only after a frontal collision, and then only at speeds above 8 miles an hour. A minor fender bender will not set it off. In the future, it will be applied to non-frontal collisions, trucks, and buses.
Ford Motor Company put Eaton airbags into a special fleet of 830 1972 Mercurys. General Motors put its airbag, which it called the Air Cushion Restraint System, or ACRS, into a fleet of 1,000 1973 Chevrolet Impalas. This is one of those 1973 Chevrolets equipped with airbags. Inside, no belts to tangle with, no buzzers or interlocks to be hassled by. The airbags are tucked away completely out of sight, here in the steering wheel and there under the glove compartment, and they'll deploy only when needed in a crash. General Motors described the airbags as, quote, a passive restraint system, which means it does not require any action by the occupant, such as buckling up lap shoulder belts. The airbag Chevrolets were a success, particularly for those who drove and crashed in them. Russ Parrish drove one, and in September of 1973, in Winston County, Alabama, he crashed in it.
Well, I was going down an old country road down in Winston County, Alabama, and me and this other car met head-on in a blind curve. There was no time to react. It was just a matter of putting on the brakes and stopping as soon as you could. We just hit head-on at that time. And the impact speed was about 24 miles an hour. Well, I did not have any safety belts on at the time. I felt going into the airbag, it felt like going into a soft feather pillow or something like this. Now, the other car was totaled out, and the people did have injuries from it, but I did not sustain any serious injuries at all. I would guess that I do somewhere between 50 and 60,000 miles a year driving time. That's the reason I do rely very heavily on the airbag.
The airbag-equipped Chevrolets performed impressively.
GM indicated that it would offer its airbag option on more than 1 million cars during the 1974 through 1976 model years. To help sell its airbag option, GM in 1973 made an enthusiastic marketing film. This is an excerpt from that film.
The GM air cushion restraint system senses that a frontal crash is occurring and activates the restraints. To accomplish this, the system uses a bumper impulse detector. A second crash sensing system is mounted beneath the instrument panel. A third detector is activated in more severe frontal crashes. The passenger air cushion inflates and extends from the steering wheel to the right door. The entire sequence of a 30-mile-per-hour barrier crash is completed in about 1/8 of a second from instant of contact through car rebound from the barrier. The in-car switches respond to direct frontal impacts and angular frontal impacts left or right of the car's direction of travel, but are not affected by simple side or rear-end impacts. The parts and the system have been evaluated in thousands of pre-production tests. Various car collisions were staged and over 100 human volunteers tested the system. Naturally, years of research and testing have gone into the development of the air cushion restraint. The Southwest Research Institute in San Antonio ran tests using volunteers under controlled conditions. We asked them to find out how people react if there were an inadvertent firing. The driver is a middle-aged woman. She knows that we can trigger the ACRS, but she doesn't know when.
What did you think of the sound? Did the noise bother you?
It startled me, yes.
Were you able to maintain control of the car at all times?
No problem at all. It was just a moment, and then you could put the bag right down and see.
Even when your passenger is just a tot, the belt, the love seat, and the ACRS provide security. The ACRS offers freedom and comfort to owners and passengers and meets all federal requirements for occupant protection.
In June of 1973, GM revealed that it would make and sell not 1 million cars equipped with its ACRS airbag option, but only about 10,000 such cars through the 1976 model year, and only high-priced luxury cars. The airbag marketing film was given little public distribution. In fact, GM's promotion of its ACRS option was so minimal that few people had a chance to learn that the airbag was even available. Nevertheless, demand was high enough that by early 1976, GM had sold more than 8,000 cars equipped with airbags. By now, a number of people who knew about airbags and wanted to buy them were finding that they couldn't get cars with the ACRS option.
I feel very strange not having the airbags when I'm now driving my new car. These have not been available, and they will not take any orders for them until they are available. And I don't feel safe without them.
Dr. Arnold Arms, a Kansas City physician, had a special reason for wanting airbags in his new car. He'd had them in his former car, and he'd been in a crash.
About 5:30 o'clock in the evening, I left my office after a very hard day's work to make a house call, and within a short distance of my destination, I became drowsy, and the first thing I knew, I was headed head-on for a collision with the biggest city transport bus that's available. I recall very well saying to myself, well, this should be your last house call. The bus was going about 20 or 25 miles an hour, and I estimated that I was traveling about the same speed when we collided head-on. I had a car with airbags, but I was not wearing my belt. I recall very well, within seconds after the crash, seeing what had happened. The airbag filled the front of the steering wheel, and it was lying on my lap. I could see I was alive. I could see that I had no broken bones. To my surprise, I didn't have a headache. I did not have a whiplash injury. I was able to walk. The airbags had certainly done something that I had never realized was possible within a piece of safety equipment.
To look at what happens in crashes of cars similar to Dr. Arms, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety ran impact tests of two 1975 Oldsmobile 98 sedans. one, like his, with GM's ACRS airbag option, and one without.
The non-airbag car crashed at 35 miles an hour.
The airbag-equipped car crashed at a higher speed, 38 miles an hour. The dummy occupants in both cars were without safety belts, as are about 70% of American drivers and passengers on the highways.
As a doctor, I feel quite certain that the airbags prevented me from having severe lacerations of my face and possibly chest from flying glass. These bags sustained me in one position. Without this, I certainly would have been forced forward and maybe would have gone out of the front windshield. Nearly every doctor that stopped me at the hospital wanted to know how they could get hold of an airbag, that they wanted one for their own safety. You won't feel comfortable once you've known how they work and have had an experience of being saved from a fatal accident by using them. This goes for my driving or driving in anyone else's car. I just don't feel comfortable knowing that that protection isn't there. If anyone had been sitting next to me, my child or my wife, the airbag would have inflated them and protected them exactly the way it did to me. I think it can save many, many lives, and I think it can keep many bodies from being mangled.
By early 1976, cars with airbags had been driven some 200 million miles on American highways. More than 80 of the cars had been in crashes severe enough to deploy the bags.
I was hurrying because I was late, and I would say I was doing between 45 and 50 miles per hour. There was a car coming out of a side street, and she continued to go across the road, and I tried to veer the car to the left, and with that, we hit. I would have been hurt very badly if I didn't have them, because I don't use seatbelts. I would have gone right through the windshield. This is the car that was in the accident, and as you can see, it's all fixed up. The airbags are back, which I'm very grateful for, and this is our security blanket, my family and myself.
I never saw him pull out, so when I came over the hill, I was doing about 40 or 45 and ran into the back of him.
Like in a split second, there was the bag.
And we didn't have our seatbelts on.
If it weren't for that airbag, I would have kept going forward. I would, it's what held me back.
There were no injuries at all. I was not wearing my lap belt. The airbag itself kept me well in place. I just feel secure knowing that that thing is there.
I went about 45, maybe 50 miles an hour. Then I lost control of my car.
We crossed the 4-lane highway, hit the guardrail there, and it just rattled and kept on rattling until once we were down in the ditch, and then I realized what had happened.
Yeah, the airbags are really what held us. I believe it saved our life.
If it wouldn't have been for the airbags, I'd be dead. Tell the truth.
I had no choice but to go into the yard. I hit the tree doing 30 miles an hour. The airbag had come up, it had gone down, and the crash was over before I even realized they had worked. It was that fast. I believe in the airbag. I think it kept me from being hurled through the windshield.
This fellow came right into me just head on, and there was absolutely nothing I could do to avoid the collision. The speed of impact was approximately 35 to 38 miles an hour, and I would only imagine that the oncoming car was going about the same speed, so it had to be about a 60, 70 mile an hour collision. The airbags immediately were deployed. I recalled absolutely nothing but the impact, of course, and my windshield shattering, and within a few seconds after that, I was immediately sitting upright, looking around to see what really had taken place, and I was perfectly all right. Nothing happened to me. I was fully mobile and able to go back to work within an hour after the crash. I'm totally sold on a system, no question in my mind about it. I feel that the airbag were made standard on the automobile. It just would relieve many families of heartbreaking traumatic experiences.
In 1975, Volvo, the company that was first offering standard equipment safety belts as early as 1959, installed airbags in a fleet of its cars much smaller than the GM luxury sedans with airbags. In a test by the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, a Volvo without airbags was crashed at 35 miles an hour, and one with airbags was crashed at 36 miles an hour. The occupant dummies in both cars were unbelted.
Well,
It's obvious that different means, or any mean that can keep the passenger, the occupants in a car, positioned safe in the car when coming into a crash is of very great value. If you could find a system where no initiative was requested from the occupant, a passive system, that would of course be the safest one. Everybody, 100% of all the people inside the car would be using it.
The Volvo airbags served as a soft protective buffer in this crash. But in the car without airbags, the occupants' heads and bodies hurtled into the car's interior structures. The passenger occupants of the Volvos, with and without airbag protection. And here a very detailed look at the passenger heads, without and with the airbag. Unprotected by restraint systems, this driver crashed violently into the car's interior. Notice the crushing of the throat against the steering wheel. But in this airbag-equipped Volvo, the driver impacted not hard structure, but a soft pillow. This kind of automatic restraint system in frontal and front angle impacts, coupled with lap belt use, is the best all-around protection available for people in car crashes. Research has found no cure-all for death and serious injury in each and every car crash. But as we've seen, it has found ways to greatly reduce the damage to human beings in the kinds of violent crashes that claim the majority of driver and passenger lives. Safety belts can help for people who use them. For everyone, belt users and non-users alike, airbag technology can help much more. More, in fact, than any other protective system yet developed. But until airbags are standard equipment on the American highway, tens of thousands of us will die and millions be injured needlessly and inexcusably.